All right, I am here with Jessica Burbank. She talks about all things MMT and economics, and it's a big pleasure to have you on. So we'll be talking a little bit about, of course, MMT, sort of branching out into wider economics, some current day issues, and just seeing where that leads us. So Jessica, can you please give a short intro about yourself?
Hi, everyone. Happy to be on. This has been in the works for a while, and I'm glad we're finally doing it. Yeah, so my background is just growing up in the recession in the United States, being pretty critical of what's going on in the country, not really understanding why exactly we can't have nice things, but really believing a lot of the myths that we're told of, someone somewhere has run the numbers, and that's why we can't have nice things. And growing up in a household where no one has a college degree, what you hear on the news, you pretty much just accept as what's going on. There's not really an alternate perspective. And my parents are critical thinkers, but a lot of this stuff, you don't really learn economics or anything of the sort in public school in the United States, although I think we should. And it wasn't really until undergrad that I was exposed to a lot of these perspectives. I ended up going to trade school because that was the surest bet at financial security. It didn't look like I was going to get to go to college. Got really lucky, went to a really small school, studied under, some heterodox professors that really shaped my brain. Kent Klickgard, who's an environmental economist, was a big mentor to me, as was Takumbi Lumumba Kasongo, who's more in the social sciences. And so learning under them was huge. Ended up finishing and trying to go into law. Thought that was the place to go to change some things, and found that that really wasn't for me. And there really wasn't much to do, so I went to grad school. I thought that would be the way to do fun and interesting things. After doing a lot of econ in undergrad, studying a lot of political science and international studies, I figured public policy was the best route for me. Ended up doing data-driven public policy and thinking a lot about the monetary system, but it's understudied. How fiscal policy and monetary policy can be different wasn't as much of a conversation as it should have been in the econ departments and in graduate school. And so I do a lot of that now, but after grad school, I worked for the Bernie Sanders campaign, where I, figured out the works of Stephanie Kelton because she was his economic advisor in the budget committee. And then from there, just studied that a ton, ended up doing more data work for organizing, and just doing TikTok on the side and really keeping up with a lot of what I studied in grad school on TikTok. Great use for my grad degree, but that's been really fun. And I've just been really lucky to be able to explore these ideas now. Now I do work with the Young Turks covering stories, everything, but a lot of econ as well.
Cool, cool. So that's an interesting origin story. So I think with a lot of these ideas, where sort of you're kind of coming in from different sides into the mainstream rather than sort of sitting within the mainstream. There's these watershed moments where it's like, ooh, like I was sort of curious about this thing, and then this opened a whole new world. So if you could, what was really the watershed moment for you? Like what policy issue or what economic theory that you sort of explored that really opened up a new way of looking at economics?
That's super interesting. There was a moment in graduate school where we were learning about UBI. And to many people, this really seems like the one thing that will fix, capitalism, right? Everyone has an income, everyone can meet their most basic needs, which many people agree should be guaranteed because for so many years throughout history, human beings became the dominant species on the planet because they worked together to meet their needs collectively. This is something Adam Smith talked about a lot. And we've kind of gotten away from that, and it's a huge problem, right? We've intentionally designed scarcity so that people can make money off of people meeting their most basic needs. And it seems like the right thing to do, right? We can create money, we should give everyone income so they can meet their needs. This will not solve the problems of consumerism, and it also will not necessarily solve class divisions in the country. And I really just didn't understand why so many people were obsessed with UBI. And we were talking about it in this class, Policy Problems of the 21st Century, which I just found my notebook for. And my notebook was completely empty. I was like, why didn't I take any notes? But I asked the professor, I said, isn't there a world where UBI can maintain class divisions more intensely because you have these people living and working for a set wage, and you have all of the people who, run computer algorithms, they own capital, they own the means of production. For all intents and purposes, they're making all of the economic decisions for how our resources are used as a society. And she said to me, you sound a lot like someone named Minsky. Have you read Hyman Minsky ever? And I was
Okay.
like, no, I hadn't. And so I started reading some Minsky, and that was really, the moment where I said, I need to figure out, without revolution, what policy changes can be made for how our society is structured to actually fix these problems. And it wasn't until I came across Kelton. She did an interview with Ryan Graham about how the monetary system was set up and how if we really change how money flows in society, that's really the key to changing everything else. It's not going to be UBI, but that was really the gateway for me, was the UBI debate, which is fascinating. And it wasn't the first time I was exposed to heterodox ideas, but it was the first moment where I really felt like I started understanding solutions and not just being able to describe the problems really well.
Yeah, and so then in sort of those sort of immediate moments after, or like moments in a macro sense, of reading Minsky and listening to Kelton for the first time. So where did that take your mind, of like you were curious about UBI and now sort of you got these new thinkers under your belt? Where did that lead you?
Yeah, so where I discovered Kelton was sometime after first, realizing that there's got to be better solutions out there than what mainstream economists, but also mainstream media and people in the political establishment, what they're talking about. They pretend to have all of these ideas for solutions, and just gridlock is in Congress is why we can't do anything, which is just absolutely not true. And so after that, I started working in the research space, doing randomized control trials to try and assess the impacts of policies, working in labs with behavioral economists, which is so random. But a lot of these policy solutions were pretty much we have to means test something and just incentivize people to make better decisions for their own financial lives. And so there was this policy program called the Road to College. It was in Rhode Island. I was at Brown, so RHODE, kind of a play on words. But in any sense, just not an effective policy. They took the highest performing high school students based on their test scores and put them in this college readiness program, right? And if you complete like SAT prep, you're going to get a gift card. And that's the incentive. And that's how we're going to get these kids to go to college who are from low income families. And it's like, if you really think that not being motivated to do college readiness prep is the barrier to low income kids going to college, and really so much money is going into this research. I was super critical of how our economic system was set up and how so many people who are so intelligent and who have so much power and so many resources to bring change and produce policy research to give to Congress and people in power to say, like, this is proven to do X, Y, and Z thing, you should do it. But really what needs to happen is we've got to change the distribution of resources in our society and how resources are used and how economic decisions are made. And just really seeing that no one was working towards that ends, I was super passionate about it and was always talking about it. And the director of my graduate program was like, hey, there's going to be this TED conference at Brown. You should apply to talk about it. And I was like, there's no way they're going to let me get on stage and talk about how our economic system is awful. And like, there's this new and better one. And people talk about socialism and they don't understand what the word means. And so I just pitched it because I was like, that's the only thing I would really want to talk about. And they were like, yeah, let's interview you. And I was shocked. I was like, they're not going to end up letting me get through, but maybe they're just honoring that, this person, referred me. they ended up saying, yeah, that this was a good thing, a good idea, that I should go talk about it. And so there's a lot of research that went into putting that talk together because it was just like years of assessing how the economic system is set up, what are other things that have been tried, what's gone wrong, definitely, but also what went wrong for reasons other than, it's a bad idea. So a lot of people will point to like the United States intervening wherever socialism's been tried abroad, even when like democratically elected socialist leaders come to office. Why is the United States, cooing those leaders? We really haven't gotten to see what a truly democratic economy looks like. And we've been taught to fear this word socialism before we ever get to the point of trying it. And so I think if more people understood that idea, that democratic principles can be applied to economics, that it's not fair that we don't make decisions about how the resources are used in our society. And so I really wanted to make that case. And that was a lot of research about just how to communicate ideas, but moreover, it's when I discovered Stephanie Kelton and didn't fully understand it at all. But I wanted to make sure that in this talk, I didn't say anything that contradicted her yet, because I knew that one day I might agree with her, but I didn't have time to deep dive into MMT. But as soon as I gave that TED talk, it was actually all MMT after that. All of my free time was reading about MMT while canvassing for the Bernie Sanders campaign. So really, that was what launched the next phase.
Gotcha. And I believe the title of that TED Talk is A New Direction for the U.S. Economy. So if
Yes.
anybody, wants to go check that out, please do, TEDx.com or wherever on YouTube. And so, yeah, so I thought it was definitely an interesting talk and definitely about like, okay, let's talk about refreshing ideas and the emphasis on new. Um, but where I also kind of like have had my share of watershed moments and kind of coming into this, and as you say, sort of destigmatizing certain perspectives. When I look at the history of the U.S. economy, so the past of it, you actually see that there's a lot more conducive to these new ideas that was going back in, the mid 20th century, the early 20th century, the 19th century. And sort of obviously room for improvement, of course, but the ideas of the formation of economics as a discipline and more so the implementation of economic policy. Um, Very much so, there was this entrepreneurial state, this interventionist state that was creating an industrial base, that was creating jobs for people. And scholars for me that are super important in this dynamic are people like Han-Jun Chang and Eric S. Reinhardt, really going in and exploring not just the United States, but basically almost any country that develops. The study of development economics is really the study of these specific state-led programs that coordinate the private sector to adhere to specific types of activities, to providing jobs for people in adequate ways, and to making sure, especially from the point of view of, you're doing this for real and for a healthy economic future, that you're breaking down existing colonial relationships. So where does your sort of brain go when you think about the wider world of sort of development economics and the history of the ideas, and that they really shouldn't be that stigmatizing?
Yeah, I love the framing of this. I spent a lot of time in undergrad. Takumila Mambakusungo is someone who's big in development economics. Never thought I'd be learning about that stuff, but because I really admired him, I took every class I could with him and ended up learning a lot about the colonial approach to development economics, which so many people hear the phrase economics or even development economics and they just associate it with the dominant narrative and who's in power right now instead of appreciating the discipline for really what it is, which is, like you said, the study of how an economy comes to be, right? How do we help people collectively meet their material needs through very complicated systems, but necessary systems? And of course, you have the history of like the World Bank and the IMF with these predatory loans, getting countries into debt, as soon as the United States removed the gold standard as far as, international or foreign entities being able to exchange their dollars for gold, then you had all of these dollars being printed and sent to these countries so that they're in debt. And the development model was pretty much to create raw goods that could be used by, imperial countries. It doesn't have to be like that, right? Development economics doesn't have to be what the IMF and World Bank designed it to be. And now even you have very progressive leaders of the World Bank that want to move away from that development model and really just care about, how do we make a society where people meet their needs and flourish? And I think that's such an exciting topic. And it really brings me to like the foundation of MMT, like where I really like to start the conversation is this is not disconnected from the entrepreneurial state like you mentioned, but the Virginia Bay colony. Randall Wray talks about this a lot. He has a much better talk on it, but I'll give a regurgitation now where, you had people going over to the States wanting to start colonies, but they had to make things run. Things had to function. People had to grow food. They had to have schools and police and all sorts of things to keep themselves safe. And they really needed to put people to work in various ways so that society doesn't collapse, so that the colony is successful. And what they did was they created this thing called Virginia Notes. And the Congress that was there met and they said, all right, we're going to set a tax rate of X% on property and commerce and things like that. And we're going to create X amount of Virginia notes. And we're going to issue the notes. People will have to use them because we have the authority to levy a tax against them. So there's now demand for this currency because we're going to tax you for it. So if you want to live here, you've got to find a way to get it, which means you've got to get a job, you've got to grow food, you've got to teach the kids, you've got to do all of the things that are necessary for our society to function. At the end of the year, things were going well, right? There were farms, there were schools, people were collecting the trash, people were building infrastructure. And they collected their taxes in Virginia notes and burned them. This is very fascinating. When you think about currency, a lot of people think of the dollar as having like intrinsic value. And if we create more dollars, all of the dollars that already exist are devalued. The government needs dollars in order to fund any spending. No, any currency issuer has complete control over the money supply. And of course, it's important to keep an eye on where the money supply is at, make sure, money that's new, that's entering the economy is going to the right places. But this story really illustrates that they don't need their own currency. They're issuing the currency for the purpose of controlling this society, quite frankly, of making sure things run. Now, it would be more democratic if people met and we said, how should this new currency enter the economy, right? What sorts of programs do we want to have happen? What sorts of crops do we want to grow? What kind of infrastructure do we want to have? That's what a more democratic approach will look like. That's why I say in this case, the government really was controlling the economy to a certain degree by making decisions about where the currency goes. But the government doesn't need its own currency. And that's the first thing we really need to fundamentally understand to understand MMT, is that a currency issuer doesn't have to go and find Virginia notes somewhere else. They create them. They burn them at the end of the year. And this analogy is still very useful because people need dollars to pay their taxes, but also the deficit is merely a record of all of the dollars that have entered the economy that haven't yet been taxed back out. So everyone right now is talking about how we increased the money supply very recently, but they're failing to talk about that the IRS had a record collection. And so the deficit shrank a bit. And so people are blaming current inflation on essentially hyperinflation, saying that the dollar has lost its value. No, of course the government, if they print too much money, can cause inflation, because if too many people, have new money in their pockets, you're going to see that increased demand, right? If people are spending that money back into the economy, especially if you're giving it to people with a high propensity to spend. But are we hyperinflating the dollar right now? No, absolutely not. The dollar still has a strong trading value internationally. And what we see with inflation is, prices have gone up in certain sectors, especially when we see the price of fuel go up. We're going to see that reflected everywhere else because all the way along the supply chain, you're going to need to use fuel. It just increases production costs. But also we're seeing that corporations have record profits, right? They're not hurting. They're not making up for losses by increasing prices. And so that's when we get into the territory of price gouging. But at the end of the day, understanding that we don't have a gold-backed currency, understanding that the government can create the currency that it needs to, and it doesn't have to go and find it somewhere or collect it out into the economy. It needs to spend it first into the economy and put it out there and then tax it back out. And that's what creates demand for the currency. And also that money is just a tool to help our society function.
Yeah,
Those are the fundamentals.
Yeah, and that's where I always found such of a clever insight of the MMT world, is that you look at money from one layer of that, it's actually infrastructure. It's like whatever you want to say about the various levels and where it's going and how people are using it, what's the circulation. There's a fundamental reality that money is like a copper wire for electricity to go over. And it's like, if you do not have enough copper wire, you're just not going to have a proper dissemination of electricity. So like there's a similar concept here. It's like, it's not the fact that you don't have the labor doesn't have the skills, that you don't have the real resources, whatever it might be. It's like all those things can be there. And the issue is actually that you don't have the infrastructure in place too. Like using another analogy, like you don't have the roads to connect all the towns to actually increase the commerce that is going on between them. So that's where it's like for the MMTers, it's like they're saying, no, you actually need to at times expand the monetary supply in certain directed ways to actually provide that infrastructure for people.
Precisely. Yeah. I love where this conversation is going. I talk a lot about real productive capacity, which, if you're not exposed to economics, can be a weird phrase, but it's really just what is the potential for the amount of things, the goods and services we can produce, the things of real value we can create as an economy? And that's an exciting question, but a daunting one if you consider how our current economy is set up, and we don't have much control over how people with capital are using, our real productive resources. So things like tools, machinery, land, natural resources, and labor, especially. They get to decide where labor is directed. That is not a democratic principle. When you have a few people who have wealth, who have capital, who have resources, they are making decisions about our entire labor force. So if you're born into the United States, you have a choice, unless you're born into a wealthy family, of course, but how are you going to sell your labor to survive? It's not an if, it's not a, maybe I'll go out in the woods and, collect berries and live the old fashioned way. I don't want to partake in this. I don't want to sell my labor to someone else. But really your choice is precisely that. You've got to sell your labor to someone else at a value that's less than your labor is worth, in order to pay your bills to survive. And that's a coercive structure. And so MMTers really are fighting to democratize the economy in this sense, because the way the economy is currently designed, a lot of people will say it's the industrial reserve army, as Marx talked about it, but this necessary pool of people who are unemployed, so that there's a great demand for labor. Because if you're out of work, you're more willing to take a job for low wages if you're competing with other people who are also out of work. Because, like I said, you've got to meet your most basic needs, you've got to live, you've got to pay the bills. And so all of this really comes down to MMTers saying that's unnecessary. And that's really freeing and really exciting. It's unnecessary to keep people unemployed. And right now we hear the Fed talking a lot about why they're raising interest rates. And their working theory for how they're managing the money supply is quite insane. So there's these private banks that they've been outsourced to be the people who put money into the economy by the government, instead of the government directly injecting money into the economy, which I'll get to in a second. But the theory is that you give the banks money at a set interest rate, The banks will loan out that money to people who will start businesses, hopefully successful ones, usually not, right? We see the rate of businesses, being successful after 10 years, it's like 75% or something of them fail. That's probably inflationary, but not the main point. The point is that, they're going to start businesses. If the interest rate is quite high, less people will want to loan money because that's more expensive. Less people will start and invest in businesses. There will be less jobs. Wages will, go back down because there's more competition in the labor market. More people are unemployed. Terrible system to keep people unemployed by necessity for your economy to function. Not to mention, there actually hasn't been a demonstrated relationship between inflation in the economy and interest rates being adjusted. So if you want to talk about data-driven policy, this has been set in stone since pretty much the 70s with no real demonstration in the data that there's a relationship here. And that's a huge debate among, neoclassical economists and Keynesians versus MMTers right now. And Kelton and Krugman duke it out in the Washington Post and the New York Times all the time about this. But this is a crisis. This is not necessary. And they call this the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment, to keep unemployment at a certain level, with the theory that, adjusting this will resolve inflation, keep it at about 2%, which is what they consider to be healthy. There are so many other things we could be doing. First of all, if we let our economy get to the place of full employment, meaning that everyone who wants a job can get a job, that is not inflationary. You are having these people produce more goods and more services. So if there's more money in the economy, more people are spending their wages, more people have money to spend, demand's going to go up. But also you've just increased GDP. You've increased the amount of goods and services that people are producing. And so if you're using basic supply and demand to describe this relationship, it's not going to suffice to describe it, because as I just stated, when supply increases and demand increases, you're pretty much on the curve. You're doing fine. And so even by their neoclassical logic, this policy and this practice doesn't make sense. And so MMTers say, instead, Congress should vote to spend money on things that increase our productive capacity, or increase, things of value in a very meaningful way for long-term sustainability. So a lot of talk about the Green New Deal. If the government decides to vote to fund a program, that's all it really takes, is if Congress votes to fund any spending, the Fed by law must issue those dollars, must credit them to that account. And so people saying that the Fed is some private entity that's not a part of the government is ridiculous and misleading, because by law they must do what Congress legislates. And so we could vote to spend money on building green energy infrastructure, right? Building a wind farm. This would put people to work. This would create long-run sustainable energy. Wind turbines essentially pay for themselves after about 10 years. It moves us away from fossil fuels. It's great for climate change. And you can run all kinds of programs for this. This increases our productive capacity because now we have very inexpensive energy that can be used to produce other things. So it's a win-win scenario in that case. Yeah. It's really hard to argue with MMT when it's this kind of really basic logic and reasoning. And there's not a lot of math involved to understand things like that. But it does get tricky, because then people say, well, how do you know when putting more money out there isn't going to put productive capacity to use or expand the productive capacity of the economy? And that's pretty straightforward. You could just look at your measure of inflation. Of course, you have to understand the context, right? Is there a supply chain issue somewhere down the line? Are we, sanctioning a country that produces a lot of grain or a lot of oil or something? All of those things lead to inflation. But when we're hyperinflating the dollar, when we're putting additional dollars into the economy when it's already at full speed, that's when we've got to worry. So what are the indicators of it being at full speed? Well, do we have real productive resources to put to use? Are we already at full employment? Is everyone who is seeking a job employed actually already? Do we have computers that maybe we could put to use that, employees that are already working somewhere could then start using that real productive capacity? They could become, more effective if we throw some dollars behind creating new machinery or putting new tools to use or buying computers from somewhere abroad. But if we're at the point where any new dollars will not go to things like that, there's nothing else out there that we can buy to increase our productive capacity, then we're at full speed. And the best indicator really is full employment, because it's clear as day. We know who is unemployed. We collect data on that as a society, and it's approximate, but it's pretty good. And once we get to full employment, we know that spending additional money will not put new productive capacity to use, and it will be inflationary.
Yeah, and that's what's the most refreshing thing too about MMT, that far from being the caricature of what a bad man like Larry Summers might describe.
Bad,
Um,
bad man.
yeah. Um, that, oh, well, they don't live in reality, or it's like it's all, these great abstractions and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, actually, it's the complete opposite. It's that the MMTs are actually living in reality. They're actually talking about not just like paper balance sheets that you can just write in any number you want. They're saying, like, what are the actual, you know, real resources on the ground? Like when you look at capital, when you look at labor, what is actually going on? Like, what is actually, how do we allocate scarce resources? The fundamental definition of economics. And so they bring back in the qualitative and the subjective and the art of governing, because it's not so much, oh, well, we get in whether we're the center left or the center right, and we both agree we have to have balanced budgets and we have to think very sort of binary and quantitatively. When it's like you're saying, it's like, no, let's actually talk about like what would be a good sector to invest in. What is the right jobs for people to have? And it's like, and there's the baseline, which is, are we at full employment? And then it becomes, well, are those jobs actually contributing to the underlying value in the economy? And that's where you start to bring up the quantity theory of money, which is sort of can be used for bad and for good. And it's the main reason why people have this relationship fixed in their head of, okay, so you have the quantity theory of money. Money times velocity equals the price level times the real goods and services in the economy, PY. So it's like the traditional economic jargon goes, well, you hold velocity constant because reasons, and then you hold the goods and the service in the economy constant because reasons. And so now you have this direct relationship. So whenever you increase the money supply, de facto, you've caused inflation and vice versa. But again, like you were getting at, well, actually, if you play with the algebra a bit, you actually realize increasing the money supply can affect, if we don't hold Y constant, what the real goods and services in the economy are. So actually, by increasing the money supply, there is an outcome here where you actually lower inflation. And so far be it from the sort of solutions that are parroted right now of, well, there needs to be a contraction, there needs to be high interest rates, we need to cause unemployment to reduce demand, that will solve everything. No, actually, we might be in a situation where we need to expand the money supply or expand credit from sort of an indirect method through the private banking sector. There needs to actually be more infrastructure in the economy in this monetary sense, in the real economy, and not in this sort of fake asset world that so many of these people live in.
Exactly. Yeah. I get so much feedback because I talk about this stuff in a very public way where I'm at the mercy of like the internet and algorithms for where my videos go. And it reaches a lot of people who have a background in the kind of economics that you learn in a school that wants you to go get a job afterwards, right? They want you to work for a business, and the kind of econ that is taught for people who go into finance and for people who go into business, it's a lot of market-based economics, it's a lot of models. And my advisor Kent said all models are wrong, some models are useful, which is probably the most important thing you can know if you're studying economics. But it's true that they are living in a world that's pretty disconnected from reality, right? You've got all of these models, you've got your idea of what should be happening in the market, even if you think about the kind of trading that goes on in the stock market. I mean, they're really not living in reality. It's a lot of futures trading, it's a lot of swaps. These aren't the real prices of things. They really have little to do with what's going on in the real economy. And to have these people assume that because they understand markets and they understand finance, that they understand public money and they understand how to manage a monetary system, you hardly hear people talk about the monetary system in economics courses. And so because there are these people that think because they've sorted it out and they've got the ISLM curve and all of these different models to explain things, that they've got a full understanding about how things should go. It's just not real. And so because our capacity for understanding data is so much better now, it's a lot easier to say, well, we can't actually demonstrate these models in the data, so perhaps we've got it wrong. Perhaps it's time to question these models and go back to what do we actually know? But also refocus the folks that do think, like you said, anytime we increase the monetary supply or the money supply, it's going to be inflationary. A lot of these people actually still believe we have something like the gold standard. They really think that we have a backed currency. I get comments all the time that's like, unless we increase the supply of gold, of course we can't increase the currency. And it's like, oh no, 1934, we passed the Gold Reserve Act. You've had people in the United States couldn't go to the Treasury and say, like, here are my dollars, give me some gold. And then in 71, foreign countries couldn't do it either. And so it hasn't been in place for quite some time. We've got a fiat currency. We don't have anything intrinsically backing our dollars other than the real productive capacity of our economy. That gives our dollars value, the authority of the American government. All of those things give our currency value. But understanding that inflation is simply a measure of price increases over time, and that the most common figure we talk about on the news and in financial columns, Summers talks about this one a lot, is CPI, the Consumer Price Index. What they're doing is they're running surveys to households saying, what did you buy and at what price? It's not like they're taking a thermometer, right, and injecting it into the economy and scientifically reading the dollar is worth this percent less, which really, if you observe discourse among people online who talk about inflation, it seems like they think the Fed has this down to a science, that they're taking the temperature of what's going on in the economy, saying, inflation's at this much, so that means we need to do X, Y, and Z policies. It's not as clear as that. So if I report back to the Fed, say I get surveyed, or like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I say like I'm buying X, Y, and Z at, this price, I am one person. I could not be buying anything that has gone up in price over the past year or the past few months. Someone else could be buying things that have all gone up in price. And so if you look at what they do is they take an average market basket. So it's not like they're tracking every single thing in the economy and weighting it equally, but really, what are the most people buying? What are the items that are the most popular? And they weight them accordingly. And they have this average market basket of goods, and they're tracking the price change over time. So let's say you don't spend any money on the things that are going up in price. You're not going to experience that your dollar has any less value. It has, you're buying the same things that you always have at the same price. And there will always be people who say, well, if prices go up, you can buy less with your dollars, and so your dollar is devalued. It's not as clean as that. And so we really have to go back to this reality of what is inflation measuring? This tool is not perfect by any means. And the Fed's response is basically, we'll adjust interest rates a little bit and hope that resolves it. And so it's just such a mess. And Jeremy Olshan has this great analogy. He works with Market Watch and does a podcast with Stephanie Kelton. He always talks about the Fed's trick of adjusting interest rates as adjusting a thermostat to hopefully change the temperature. But as we would point out, when you adjust the thermostat, there's actually, things that happen in your heating system where the temperature will go up, right? More water will get boiled, it'll go through the pipes or whatever, your house will get heated. That's a system. But we haven't actually observed that when we increase interest rates, we're going to see inflation go back down. And so it's not a science. And so many people think it is a science and they think they're doing science, but what they're doing is disconnected from reality. And that is the main thing to take away. And it sucks because you always hear people say, like, MMTers are living in a fantasy world. They think we can just print more money to get rid of all of our problems. And that's not what we're saying. We've been always very clear about what the constraints are for spending. And more importantly, it's not reality that for every dollar you print, every other dollar is devalued, or it's going to lead to price increases somewhere. And Rowan Gray puts this really well, where he says, if new money enters the economy and price setters aren't around to see it, will prices go up? Will we experience inflation? And that demonstrates that pretty well. Because I don't think we would see inflation. However, if we gave everyone dollars, working class people with a high propensity to spend, right, that means their quality of life will increase if they spend some more money and get some more things that they would need or would make them more comfortable. Whereas, if someone has a lot of money, if they get a few more dollars, they might just save it, right? Their quality of life might not change that much for a few additional dollars. But let's say we do give money to people with a high propensity to spend. We give everyone like $10,000. Yeah, that's going to lead to an increase in demand and therefore price increases and therefore inflation. That's not what MMTers are proposing at all. We're proposing that we spend money to get to full employment. And I think the coolest part about all of it is it will actually improve people's quality of life. And I think the reason people believe, the folks who are, living in the fantasy world, right, our finance bros, our Larry Summers neoclassical economists that are clinging to theory that's essentially been disproven at this point, but they sound really smart and they went to the best schools and they've done the math and they've got these models that look really advanced. People believe them because they're telling the public that if we don't do this, your life's going to get worse. You're going to have to spend more money on things. And that's really scary. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, you're like, oh no, like, I hope this guy fixes the economy because I can't afford the price of gas going up. I can hardly get to work. And so it's really exploiting fear, which is a huge problem. And so then when someone like me comes along, it's like this young girl in the cowboy hat on TikTok, and I'm like, hey, we can print more money. They're like, no, 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 this is terrifying. And so it's important to tell the story that the kind of world and economy that MMT can build is one where if we get to full employment, think about what corporations will have to do for their employees. So if the government guarantees a living wage, so like $25 an hour right now, I would say is probably what people are saying. It's definitely no longer 15. And there's full benefits and you're doing work that is meaningful, right? You're building clean energy infrastructure, things we've agreed upon that we need or want as a society. That's much more fulfilling and the pay is better. So it's going to increase the quality of work in the private sector, in markets. And that's the kind of world we would want to live in. But explaining how spending money to get to full employment and funding these programs where people will be employed as public employees and explaining that that won't cause inflation, I think is our biggest hurdle right now because of the fear that's out there.
Yeah, yeah. And to maybe use a well-worn analogy of like the Robinson Crusoe island that always kind of comes up in
Yes.
economic classrooms.
Oh, yes.
It's not perfect, but just to say, like, whether it's like an inflationary period or a recession or whatever it might be, that's like this event one where your ship crashes. And what the mainstreamers are kind of saying, like, okay, the best thing to do to survive, everyone stay still and don't do anything. Whereas the MMTers and other adjacent schools would be more so like, no, we have to create some sort of like system, some rudimentary collective organizing that like money has been a tool of that type of system for a long time to say like, okay, you guys go get firewood, you guys go get pineapples, you guys go build the shelter. And then you look at those two camps and you say, who has the higher likelihood of survival? Is it the neoliberals who say just sit on your butt and like don't actually like engage in real resource extraction and production and consumption, or is it the people that are actually engaging in that? And so like when you look at it like that way, just simply, you start to see, yeah, there is a feedback loop actually to the money supply, and that it's not just like you as a working class or a middle class person saying, oh my God, all that increase in the money supply is doing is somehow attacking me. No, it's actually going into the pocketbooks of your neighbor, your family, and also increasing the overall goods and services in the economy. So now you actually are benefiting.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's like exactly correct. So a lot of people think about the deficit as we are in debt, right? Like we have to go into debt to put all of this stuff to use and collectively meet our needs. Wrong. No, the deficit is simply a record of all of the dollars that have already been created. And the best analogy here is that the government's red ink is our black ink. Stephanie Kelton says this a lot. And it's true that they write X amount of dollars go out. They create the dollars. They're in the economy now, hopefully being put to good use, not going to a failing business or, eventually ending up staying in the pockets of billionaires who are getting tax breaks, whatever. In any case, that's dollars that are in the economy for us to use. It's our surplus, right? We're never going to have to pay that money back. And a lot of our debt is financed and is in bonds, which is unnecessary, right? We don't need to issue bonds where it's like, okay, the government's spending X amount of money. Let's sell this amount of bonds at this fixed interest rate and people buy them up for the guaranteed interest. That's not necessary. The government can simply manage the money supply without financing the debt. And so to have people think about this way of organizing the economy is, oh my gosh, we're in so much debt. If we were to have a deficit of zero, there would be no dollars to erase the deficit. That would collapse the economy. That's not a great thing to do. And so to scare people out of a system that would actually help them is a huge problem. And people always talk about the system of trade and barter initially, right? Are we going to organize all together to meet our needs, right? You get the wood, you go out and fish, whatever. But the alternative, the story, the origin story of money that you hear of on the island and Crusoe's out fishing and someone else is collecting firewood and they need to trade, but oh my God, no, I don't actually need firewood right now, but you need fish. So what are we going to do? Instead of saying like, oh, I'll give you the fish now and you'll owe me something, which is closer to what actually happened that anthropologists have found. Instead, they say they started using means of exchange like seashells, like really pretty seashells as currency. And then eventually they, created currency out of some like pretty clay with stamps. And then eventually, they get to something of real intrinsic value like gold and you're trading with gold. Not the real origin story of money, but the way they say it plays out is then you have, people worried about carrying gold around. And instead, you have these goldsmiths that would hold gold for people and give them a receipt. And then people started just trading the receipts because you can go to the goldsmith, exchange it for your gold. And the theory is that these goldsmiths ended up becoming bankers, right? And the reason that they kept the gold with the goldsmiths is because they already had safes and things to store the gold. But the idea is that because they were offering this service, they become the banks and they realize, well, no one's ever going to bring all of their receipts at the same time. And so I don't actually have to keep all of this gold here. I can issue more receipts than I actually have, right? And so this theory of like reserves and fractional reserve banking and lending by the banks. And that's how we have banks, right? That's the theory that they have for where money came from. Anthropologists who have studied history and human behavior found that that's not true. And the first records of just writing that we have from like humans were records of debt. And a lot of debt came from like kind of like gift giving. So like if you were to help a group of people, they would give you a gift and say, this is a symbol that, we're indebted to you because you helped us out. And really the origin of money is in debt. It's always been debt. And oftentimes it's been this sort of thing where it's always authority figures issuing currency when we get to the point of currency. And it's because they're able to use force to make people use the currency. They can levy taxes, right? A lot of people talk about the tally sticks, and they, break the tally stick. This is essentially the currency. You go out and you can, trade and use it for whatever you want. but they issue the currency. You have to work for them. They're going to collect it in taxes from you at the end of the year. And so most currency, most money's origin story is someone with a lot of power forcing people to use that currency so that they do work for them and they extract the value of their labor. It's always been this unequal power structure. And MMT is saying, this is messed up. It doesn't have to actually be like this. And it's really a democratic economic theory, which is, I think, missing for so many people. Just that can be a thing. It's so far-fetched, and the idea of an economic system is just not something people think about on a day-to-day basis, probably because they're trying to pay their bills because their economic system is awful and they're very distracted by just trying to get by, that they don't have a lot of mental space. The last thing people want to do, I think, at the end of the day is sit down and think, what's really wrong with our economy and how can we fix this collectively to live in a better society? Just not what people want to do when they wind down for the day.
Yeah, and like you said, like getting at that notion of, is this a democratic system? And what we've done now that we've gotten to 2022 is, you touched on it earlier a little bit, that really it's the private banking sector that is actually creating most of the money, and that the central banks of the world actually act a lot of times in this reactionary fashion where, is the tail wagging the dog or is the dog wagging the tail? And so when you see that, like some stats are that 97% of the money supply is actually this like private bank credit expansion. So then you look at it, there's obvious huge monopolization of the industry by various big banks. And then even where there are medium to small banks that are sort of strewn throughout the economy. In the US, for instance, I believe it's gone from in 2000 of like around 14,000 banks to now it's around 7,000. So there's this further and further consolidation, and thus a de-democratizing of this money creation process, and thus the money direction process of who gets it. So we keep going into this world where there's a few bankers out there that are deciding, if your family has food on the table, if there's money to supply credit for the business, that then it can pay wages at a fair level. It's like, why are we allowing this fundamental role to just be outsourced to these bankers, which have proven time and time again, they are not responsible parties? So what would you say is that answer to the question of why has there been this dereliction of duty that, seems to coincide with this 1980s neoliberal revolution?
Yes, the timing is interesting as well, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I would say the presence of bankers in positions of power, the influence of lobbying, all of these things. I mean, members of Congress since the founding of our nation were members of the ruling class. And this, of course, is not something that they would ever want taught in public schools. And so people don't really know about how things are working, so they get to manage it in whatever way benefits them, right? So many people who end up working in government were bankers with Goldman Sachs. We see it all the time. And so I would say it's because in the United States, we're pretty much living in an oligarchy at this point, where a lot of the people that are executives of banks and are owners of capital and are owners of investment firms have power in government and end up in government, or their partners are people who are bankers if they are a member of Congress. And that's a huge problem. That's a conflict of interest. Of course, those people aren't going to govern in the interests of the people. They're going to maintain this system that benefits them and keeps their pockets lined. And so how do we change a system like that? Well, I think the flow of information is very different today. And of course, I'm going to go to that because people are actually really hungry to understand what's going on in our government and what the heck is happening in our economy. We all have to live in this economy every day, right? Right now, it's bankers making decisions about how our resources are used, what our wages are, decisions that impact if we put food on the table. We all have to live with the consequences of the decisions that are made with our economic system. So why don't most people understand it? I would point to, yes, we've been intentionally left in the dark. There's not a lot of public education, but also mainstream media that's funded by corporate advertisements isn't going to run programming on how our monetary system works, of course. And so because now we have this freedom of information and how it flows, I can make a TikTok that's breaking this down. I have this, exclusive knowledge because I went into a ton of debt to go to graduate school and figure this out because I was stubbornly curious. But that's also a big mistake of the bankers and their greed, right? They want to make money off of student loan interest and financing that. And so working class kids now get to go to college and learn all of these things. And of course, as someone who grew up in, the recession and feeling the impacts of financial tightening and economic oppression in the United States, of course I'm going to be angry and want to expose how this is running. And I can, because we have things like the internet, apps like TikTok that run on algorithms where I don't have to have a power or an existing platform for people to see that video. If they find it interesting or entertaining and they watch it, the algorithm's going to reward it. Because TikTok wants people to stay on the app, they want people to keep watching. And so if someone's making content that engages people, they stay on the app longer, they watch more advertisements, TikTok makes more money. Again, capitalism leading to its own demise, because now people are watching these videos where I'm, explaining what I've learned because of, the education I have, stuff that should be taught in public school but isn't. And now people are figuring out that the things aren't so good, right? And that's really how we change it. But I think a part of the reason this change has taken so long, and we've really seen people just stick to neoliberalism for as long as they have, is because information to debunk it hasn't been out there. Really, the only information about it has been, news, which we know is just going to uphold the dominant narrative. And so when people are living in that sort of bubble of propaganda and they have the fear of wanting to meet their basic needs and being worried that there's going to be another recession if they make the wrong decisions with how they're doing fiscal and monetary policy, they'll believe the propaganda, they'll believe the news. But now there's all of these other narratives out there. So I have hope that even though it's been permanent for so long, now is the time where it's going to start changing, because I do believe in consensus-based change. I don't believe like a few people should say, we figured this all out. We're going to have a revolution because like this faction of people says we should. And, we're going to use violence to impose our will upon the people. Even if people are making decisions that are not in their self-interest right now, I don't think that's the right way to bring about change. I think it's got to be spreading this information, getting more people on board. And I think we're getting closer to that every day, thanks to how information flows, which is also why censorship is really scary, because it jeopardizes that change. But I think we're in a better place now.
Yeah, yeah. And so that brings us to definitely your presence on TikTok and really making this foundation to educate people on there about these different subjects. So, why do you think there's this impulse? I mean, and it's a matter of just sort of, you know, callousness of sort of traditional academia, embracing new things, being stubborn. But, why do you think there is sort of like, oh, you can't do that on social media. You need to spend years of your life writing away behind a closed door, and then you'll make a paper that 10 people read and nothing happens. Not saying that stuff shouldn't happen in parallel, but like, why do you think social media is so important, and this goal of dissemination and popular consensus should be a priority?
Yeah. Firstly, it's democratic. I believe in popular democracy, and I want a popular movement, right? I don't want to make this reality of an MMT driven economy real, or a democratized economy real, unless it's what people want, right? It's not going to work either if people aren't on board. And so it's important for that purpose, because I want a popular movement in our lifetime, because I want to make this real, and I also want it to work. I don't want there to be some, secret op that takes it down, and effectively so, because people don't believe in it, right? If everyone's not on board, that is a recipe for this thing to collapse. And I think after working for the Bernie campaign, I really realized that most people are quite curious and are good people. So I believe it's possible and therefore a worthwhile endeavor. When I was in graduate school, I really thought, maybe one day I would get a PhD, spend my life writing papers that no one would read. That's no way to bring about a popular movement, but it's still important work because to understand these systems as complex as they are, you need to spend all of your waking hours studying them. And that's good work for people to do so that other people can read them and apply, what they've learned. Hopefully they're effective at communicating it, or there's someone who can go and read that research paper and make it usable for everyone else. So academia is still useful, but right now it just kind of felt like my role was in spreading the ideas. So knocking doors for the Bernie campaign was the moment where I was like, yeah, most people are good and things can change. Because if you talk to someone for long enough, after they've regurgitated the stuff that they hear on the news and the stuff they hear on their Facebook pages with the people who agree on politics with them, right? People have their tribes. They have people that they trust. We're still very tribal. When I was thinking about giving the TED Talk, I really wanted to do it in a way that it would reach people and people just wouldn't hear the typical words that they hear, talked about on the left, like socialism, and immediately tune out and not get anything from it. I really wanted to reach people. So I met with this cognitive neuroscientist who's brilliant, Steve Sloman. Mm-hmm. And he really wanted to study, how do we change people's minds? And why are people so set in their political views in the United States? Why do we see polarization happening? Big questions, but cognitive neuroscientists asking them was super interesting to me. And he found some interesting answers through his research. So he found people have this thing that he calls the knowledge curse. So you would ask someone, draw a bicycle, and people would draw a bicycle from memory. And it wouldn't be functional, right? The chain wouldn't be connected to the wheels. As soon as they had to draw one, they would realize, oh, I actually have no idea how a bicycle works. But people have this idea that they could draw the bicycle because they know other people who are bike mechanics and they've seen bikes a lot, and other people create bikes and bikes are everywhere. And so they wanted to explore this phenomenon more. And they ran interesting surveys to people where they said, Congress has this new policy proposal. They're very confident they understand what its effects will be. How confident are you that you understand it? People rated their understanding. Then they asked another question where, there's this new policy. Congress doesn't understand it at all. How well do you feel you understand it? People rated their understanding much lower when Congress understood it. All other things held constant. And he's concluded through a lot of research in this similar fashion that we assume other people's knowledge is our own because we are such collective and social creatures. We depend on each other. And that's really important to know when it comes to politics, because if someone threatens the knowledge of you and your tribe, you're now not engaging in terms of, well, what do I understand? What's going on here? No, it's, I heard someone else in my tribe say this thing. I assume that they've sorted it out and they have the knowledge to back up the reasoning there. And so I'm going to regurgitate that issue as something that I support and believe in as they've said it, rather than making the decision for themselves. So if you talk to people long enough, which I would often do when canvassing, just knocking doors, talking to voters, you realize that most people have similar values. Most people are quite logical, and most people believe the propaganda of mainstream news in the United States. They believe what we've been told. They believe the dominant narrative, but they're quite capable of critically thinking. And people want to live in a society where their needs are met. People are hungry for it in the United States as well, right? They see that their quality of life has decreased over the, past few years significantly. And so change is possible. And that's the biggest thing, is that, even though we have these people on social media saying, well, I heard X, Y, and Z, people just like to be right. People just like to say things that they believe are true and things that they've heard their tribe say. I think that's all it is. And learning can be fun, and doing it in a way where it's not like, I have this knowledge and like, I know better than you because like I went to an Ivy League and blah, 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 blah. That's like not helpful at all. Like the reason that you should be teaching other people is because there is a good reason for you to get the knowledge that's in your head in their head. And that is because we can build a better society together if we build consensus around better ideas for how our society should run.
Yeah. And we spoke a little bit about some of Mark Blyth's work. And I think he has a nice adjacent notion here of that, like people are actually pretty intelligent and they get it from like a very gut instinct level. And when you try to come to them and like talk down to them and sort of use your credentialing to just say shut up and listen, or whatever, and especially you're still not providing results, like at a certain point people don't care, and now it's just a matter of antagonisms. And so now people that are feeling like you screwed over my wage level, you screwed over my employment, you screwed over the goods and services that are around me, all these things are getting screwed over because of your neoliberal policy set. Yeah, why wouldn't I want to punish you in some way, regardless of whatever I think? Because obviously, a lot of people that are disaffected are people that would be from traditional sort of like union background, or sort of people that would be conducive to some of these ideas. So fundamentally, sort of understanding that there needs to be an egalitarian footing of communication, and that there needs to actually make the effort of the communication, and thus the primary information battlefield that is opened up, as you describe, is social media. And there needs to be a diversity of opinions on there, because what seems to be the case is that a lot of people with good ideas might also be subject to this like ivory tower syndrome, where it's like they think just talking to 10 other professors all their life is actually going to make change. Meanwhile, one of the things that we've seen in the past 10 years or so come up, and as a recovering crypto bro turned skeptic, I'm very aware of it. Like the fundamental social media economic phenomenon was cryptocurrency, and people being disaffected and brought into this dead end ideology that's like, oh, it's new, it's sort of, this is the way out, this is the exit ramp. And it's not. It's just more of the same. If anything, it's just hyper neoliberalism. And so being able to get in there and actually jab with those sort of competing ideologies is so vitally important, because that's where everyone's going right now, and you're just ceding ground if you don't.
Yeah, exactly. It's really where everyone is. And the crypto thing is so interesting. At one point I was like, oh, this is like fascinating. Like I had invested in crypto before I understood it, and then I was like, oh, whoops. And it's okay. I think that's the main thing, is people feel the need to really own their identity and not change when they get new information, right? To get defensive rather than take information in and make better decisions. And I don't know where that comes from. That's something for like a sociologist or a psychologist to sort out. But I think I've grown so much from saying, okay, like let's get new information, let's change, like freedom to change who you are as a person. I think, not everyone has that, but it's really important to get people out of crypto. And it's so sad that so many people became disaffected and distrustful of the people managing the dollar, managing the money supply, managing our monetary system. That sucks that we got to the point where people hated it so much and wanted an alternative that they were willing to do anything and invest money in things they don't understand. And I remember getting so much heat for talking about crypto way before the recent crypto crashes, basically saying that what's going on here is they're taking advantage of people's fears, right? They don't want to partake in the monetary system. They're angry, taking advantage of people's anger, and they want an alternative. And they saw crypto as this alternative to the dollar when it's truly not. When cryptocurrency really gets all of its value from the investment of fiat currency, and fiat currency gets its value from, those monetary systems, the real productive capacity of those economies and the things they produce of real value, and the authority of their governments. But it's speculation at the end of the day when it gets its value from investment of fiat currency. However, there is no financial regulation, no FDIC insurance, no reserves to back up cryptocurrencies or stable coins. And that means that if you're investing money that you don't have to lose, that you're going to eventually need to exchange to dollars so that you can pay your bills, buy your food, and then it crashes or something goes wrong and there's no insurance to back up your investments in any way, or you're just losing money at a really rapid pace because it's extremely volatile. It's not even an issue with like the value of the stable coin losing its parity with the dollar, things of that nature. Even if it's just regular volatility, these people are investing in something and people are losing their houses. And so at the end of the day, it's a government failure, right? They should have made sure that they were regulating cryptocurrency way back in the day when Rowan Gray and Rashida Tlaib introduced the Stablecoin Act, where they said, you know, we've got to have FDIC insurance, we've got to have reserves, there's got to be regulation here because this could really crash significant parts of the economy and have real consequences for people. And the people who are benefiting are still rich people, right? It's just like the stock market. The people who are benefiting are the people who can put in millions of dollars, make a bunch of money, and then pull out really quickly. And at the end of the day, people like Elon Musk who are now getting sued for, you know, Dogecoin. I'm not sure what the exact lawsuit is, but like saying that he's essentially a part of a pyramid scheme by using his public platform to get all of this hype for the Dogecoin. He invests money in it, he makes money from it, he pulls out. All of the people who invested money they probably can't really afford to lose, right? The spare money that they had because they thought they were making a bunch of money off of it. When rich people pull out, that's a significant chunk of the investment that was in Dogecoin. That's going to tank the currency. When we see these sell-offs by people who have invested a ton of money in crypto, it's hurting all of the little guys. And so is this a better alternative to the dollar at the end of the day, or is it essentially the same thing? And realizing that it's hurting people who are investing in it from a place of desperation, I was like, I cannot support this anymore. But when I said stuff like that before the recent crypto crash happened, people weren't really receptive of it. People still wanted to believe in crypto, right? It's so fun. It's on your phone and there's all these different figures. We've got to make public financial technology a thing so that there is an alternative. And if you want to learn more about public fintech, highly recommend Raul Carrillo and Rowan Gray as well, but definitely Raul, who talks about this really often, where we just need financial infrastructure, public banking, and public banking that can happen on your phone. We need to make the use of currency more accessible and maybe a little bit more fun, and also democratize it so that people don't hate it, because there's only going to be worse and worse currency alternatives, I think, people trying.
Yeah, and from what I've seen a lot of the time is that like it's not like, you know, every single person that gets involved in crypto like is somehow like indiscriminately evil or something, or
Right.
none of their ideas are good. Like what I often see from the software side is like a lot of these people have great like front end ideas. Like, oh, let's make the UX more interactive and more dynamic, more easy to use, efficient. And it's like great, but it's like, you know, you're building it on this backbone of something that's unstable. Like you could do that with the traditional finance system. You could even, like you were saying, start integrating that software talent into building these public money utilities, that have those front ends that actually makes things better. And so like no one's saying there can't be innovation, there can't be advancement in these fields, but it's just getting back to this like, well, what is it premised on? Is there an actual security net for people, all this sort of stuff. So cool. So that's crypto in a nutshell. As we kind of get into this part, I thought might be fun do somewhat of a lightning round of kind of going through what you find to be the top myths of MMT and then you
Ah,
debunking them. So what would you say are the
cool.
top three myths of MMT?
That the deficit is debt and money we will all have to pay back. That's the biggest one. Obama saying, you know, the we're taking out your credit card with the Bank of China, that your children are going to have to pay off. The deficit is not foreign debt. And in fact, what is foreign debt is not necessarily a bad thing. And running trade deficits is not necessarily a bad thing because we have a surplus of goods. If there is a trade deficit, we need to be thinking about what's happening in the real economy. Also, foreign debt. Other countries want to hold dollars. There is a demand for the dollar. that is not necessarily a bad thing. Also, we will never run out of our own currency. We could have everyone cash in their foreign debt at the same time. We're not going to collapse the economy if that happens. There are things that we can do to ensure that the dollar does not collapse. We could always print new dollars, even if everyone also cashes in their bonds, which is related, not foreign held bonds, but actually treasury bonds held by people in the United States. Even if everyone cashes those in at the same time, the economy is not going to collapse. Also, that's not going to happen. There's not going to be one day where everyone goes and tries to cash in their bonds with interest. So I would say, the deficit is not foreign debt. Those two things are different. Foreign debt's not necessarily a bad thing. You will not have Uncle Sam knocking on your door saying we've got to pay off the debt. The Federal Reserve will likely push a button and credit the necessary accounts. And like I said, the real constraints on inflation and problems that will be caused as a result of this are things that can be handled in the real economy, because increasing the money supply is only a problem if it increases demand, so much so that we see extreme price increases, which is unlikely to happen because most people who hold government bonds don't have a high propensity to spend anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So then, two
That's
and three, that's one.
that's one. All right, two and three.
Yeah.
Taxes are unnecessary, and MMTers believe that taxes are unnecessary. Also, it's two things can't be true at once, and you'll see people making the same criticism. So I'm just going to use taxes as the second one. But people saying that MMTers don't think taxes are necessary. We absolutely believe in taxing the rich. It's very important to have a pretty equal money supply, right? We don't want some people hoarding a bunch of wealth. Taxing the rich is the tool we have to reduce inequality when it comes to, where money is. And also, people will say that the solution to inflation that MMTers have is to increase taxes. That is not the preferred solution. Everyone who's a proponent of MMT will tell you the best defense for inflation is a good offense, which means that you're managing fiscal and monetary policy so that you're assessing what's happening in the real economy and seeing where there are potential inflationary pressures and avoiding them. And when inflation is already there, the solution is not to raise taxes. It's just not what most people would prefer to do. There are so many other things you can do. For example, price stability measures. James Galbraith, whose father was in the administration as an economic advisor during World War II, is a huge advocate for price stability policy measures. And there are some people in Congress who are thinking about doing this right now, which I think it's a very good idea. But that is a much more preferred solution, right? Corporations that are profitable should not be increasing prices when they could still be profitable otherwise on people who are struggling to pay their bills. It's pretty simple. That's just not something that should happen. And so that's a much preferred solution to inflation than, raising taxes on people. No MMTers are saying like, this is our end all be all. And the last one is just that printing more dollars will always cause inflation every single time it's done. It's just not a clean relationship. We don't have the gold standard anymore. There are other constraints on spending. And inflation is a problem in specific case scenarios where we've put money into people's hands in a way that's increasing demand, increasing the money supply in a sense where, we're already at our real productive capacity has been met, all of our real productive resources are in use, we're at full employment, spending money into the economy then is inflationary, and there's all sorts of things that can happen in the economy that can cause prices to go up, that cause inflation, and pointing at increasing the money supply is just austerity politics. It's just a reason for people to advocate for budget cuts because they want to keep the working class vulnerable to exploitation, because as we've covered, the government is essentially run by oligarchs, by the same people who have an interest in having a high return on investment for their stocks. They want the corporations and banks to be doing well, not only because they've got investments, but also because likely their partners are working at Goldman Sachs.
Yeah. Yeah. So great. So those are the big myths of MMT debunked. I thought it'd be good now to, if you could kind of give a brief summary of the intellectual history of MMT and maybe sort of the proto movements that went and formed MMT, and then covering sort of those authors that maybe people who go read them. If there's any recommended reading you also have for people to do. So if you could elaborate on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I don't want to miss people, but I think someone really good to look at. I mean, this is the first person I read. There are people who came, before these people that I haven't read much of, but Warren Mosler is this person who has a background in like finance actually, and wasn't necessarily an academic for all of his life. And Stephanie Kelton set out to kind of debunk MMT, uh, and worked with Mosler, did a lot of reading of Mosler, ended up, at his house talking about it. She really set out to say like MMT is ridiculous, this theory is wrong, and here's why. Ended up becoming a proponent of MMT through that project. Love that
There's like a
story.
nightmare alternative universe where Stephanie Kelton's like a neoliberal show.
she became like Larry Summers' bestie
Yeah.
instead. I
Yeah.
never want to live in that universe. That's so funny. So that's huge. Also, I would say David Graeber made substantial contributions to MMT. He wrote a book called Debt, the First Something Years. Great book. Really covers the anthropological foundation of money and currency creation, which is essential for understanding MMT because we don't believe it came out of a system of trade and barter. So definitely read Graeber. There's also, Randall Wray, Bill Mitchell, who are people who are very good at explaining MMT and doing so in a way that's really accessible, even if you don't have a background in economics. There's also people like Delman Coates, who is a pastor in DC, he connects MMT to really civil rights activism, and has led like marches and things. And now we have Pavlina Chernova, who's also great, who wrote this book, The Case for a Job Guarantee. Mariana Mazzucato is also really good, would recommend reading her, definitely in the same circles as Kelton and Pavlina. And we have some newer folks who are like really developing infrastructure for MMT, like Andres Bernal, who was a policy director for AOC during her first run, Raul Carrillo, Rowan Gray, Nathan Tankis, who is, kind of self-taught, really heavy hitter. But what I would say, like in the larger context, we had, neoclassical economics. A lot of people like think Adam Smith, then I think Adam Smith would be the big one, but we also have people like Milton Friedman, and public facing figures like Reagan and Thatcher that were really like making those writings into policy, which is terrifying. Then we have like heterodox econ, where we have people like Marx, but also people like Keynes, which is sort of like, okay, these people were wrong, neoliberalism isn't great, but I still kind of believe that the way that we manage inflation and actually adjusting interest rates is kind of useful, but we can have government spending. The Keynesians, I think, are having trouble defending models that are no longer useful. And I think would benefit if they actually read MMT before they criticized it. That's my hot take. I think they would find that they probably agree with it, because if they're smart enough to understand that the neoclassical econ is not the way to go, we should probably move on to something else. But anyway, so you have the Keynesians, which is kind of like the post-neoclassical thinkers, the next iteration. They're better in terms of actually running an economy for human benefit than the neoclassical folks. The heterodox folks, like Marxists and such, would probably reject the Keynesians altogether. And then I would say MMTers are kind of this next step, right? We've taken everything we've learned from neoclassical econ, Keynesian, the heterodox folks, and we're putting it into something new and something that's very applicable. So that's where I'd say it would fall. And I'm not someone who's always been heterodox, right? I came to MMT through first studying neoclassical econ and really understanding that and believing that to be true. And then realizing the inconsistencies, moving more towards, the Keynesian way of thinking, then heterodox completely, reading a lot of Marx, a lot of Marx and Engels, all sorts of Minsky and real heterodox thinkers, and then into MMT, because keep in mind, the times that a lot of these authors were writing this theory were very different from the world we live in today. We need to update our econ theory to match the society we live in today, but also integrate it with sociology and public policy so that it's not just, people talking about models and talking about things in the classroom, but actually so that it's applicable in the real world to bring about real change and better systems. And so that's where I see MMT really falling in the history of academic thought.
Awesome. So that is a great syllabus for people to check out and dive deep into. Um, so I think this has been a really rewarding conversation of sort of deconstructing these myths and going into exactly what MMT is and how useful it can be. So yeah, is there any projects that you want to plug? Anything that where people can find you? You want to share?
Yeah, definitely tune into the TikTok. I'm going to be getting up a YouTube channel soon. I need to start writing things as well, but if you follow the TikTok and my Twitter, you'll be able to find it. Just search Jessica Burbank. It should come up. And then I'm on the Young Turks regularly, tying in how a lot of my approach to thinking about econ and the world and politics into current events. And that's a ton of fun. So tune into the Young Turks, the TikTok, Twitter, and I'll be there.
Great, great. Well, this has been fun. Thanks for coming on, Jessica.
Thank you so much. This has been awesome.